I have a confession to make. I am a Joel Osteen fan. I really love Joel Osteen. In fact, right now at home, my TiVo is recording Joel Osteen. For those of you who don't know who Joel Osteen is, he's one of those TV preachers from Texas with the Church of 35,000 and the perfect hair. And he's really a great, we just enjoy it. We call it cotton candy theology. You know, there's no real nutritional value, but it tastes good. Anyway, Joel always starts every sermon with a joke that usually has nothing to do with his sermon. So I'm going to steal one of his jokes. Says that there was a Christian man going for a hike through the woods. And all of a sudden he sees this great big grizzly bear. And the grizzly bear starts charging right at him, and he's caught. There's nothing he can do. So he says a prayer, and he says, "Dear Lord, please convert this grizzly bear into a Christian." And would you believe it or not, immediately that great grizzly bear stopped dead in its tracks, stood up on its hind legs, put its front paws together, and said, "Lord, I thank you for this food which I'm about to make." So then, every Sunday, after he tells one of these great jokes, Joel holds up his Bible and he says, "Everybody hold up their Bible." And he says, "Say it with me." If any of you watch Joel, you can say it with me. He says, "This is my Bible. I am what it says I am. I have what it says I have. I can do what it says I can do. I'm about to hear the word of the Lord. My mind is alert. My heart is open, and I'm ready to be changed." Okay, enough of Joel. The point is that I really love the Bible. I gave a sermon here last year saying how much I love the Bible. One of the reasons I love the Bible so much is that when we get a passage that Esquire read this morning, for anybody who's been in church for more than a few years, especially those of us who've grown up in the church, you've heard this passage from Ephesians 6 many times. So there's that nice factor of just experiencing the Bible again, something that you're very familiar with, that you get to hear once more. But there's also an element of meeting yourself, meeting a younger version of yourself. So when we read a passage like this from Ephesians, I'm reminded of how I read this passage when I was a little boy, and how I read it differently as a teenager, how I read it differently as a young adult, and how I read it differently now. So that, I think, is a very interesting thing, because we get to see how we've changed throughout the years and how our relationship to Scripture has changed. It also, oftentimes, we read a passage and it seems, eerily cogent to our present life. Sometimes not. This, so, what was I going to say next? Whether or not this is a unique attribute of the Bible. Now I read children's stories to my daughter, and some of these children's stories I read when I was small, and they have quite a different meaning to me now than they did then. Both of the meanings are good, but still, they seem to speak to me in a different way. And oftentimes we find that people are the same way. When I was in college, I became very close friends with and even he was my mentor, with the chaplain at my university. And at the time, I was just enamored and even in awe of his breadth and depth of the knowledge of the Bible. He knew the Bible inside and out, and he read it in a very interesting way, in a very unique, with unique interpretations. And I think most of you know I grew up very fundamentalist Southern Baptist. I went to a quite conservative college, and this was a Southern Baptist chaplain. But I think anybody would label him as pretty far to the extreme left as far as the political spectrum. So it was quite new to me to see how he read the Bible. A couple of years ago, Elizabeth and I had coffee with him, and I began to see him in a different light. This time I wasn't so amazed with his knowledge of the Bible and his unique interpretations, but his ability to read and interpret Christians. I asked him, how could you be such a liberal, for lack of a better word, Southern Baptist minister or chaplain at such a conservative fundamentalist school with all of these students. And, survive all of that. And he said, well, Brad, there's something very, he said, you have to look at it like this. When I see a teenager at one of these InterVarsity rallies carrying a sign that says, Jesus rocks, I want to run over and hug them. I want to pat them on the back and cheer them on and encourage them. And I think that's wonderful. When I see a 40-year-old man carrying the same sign, I want to hit him over the head with it. Not really hit him over the head with it. It's very passive, man. But his point was that as we grow and mature, our faith has to grow and mature also. What seems plain, what seems obvious, what seems straightforward when we're younger, as we develop a relationship with it, as we turn it inside out and look at it from different areas, from different perspectives. Because as we grow, we stand in different perspectives. So we see it differently. So what was simple becomes complex. What was straightforward becomes more nuanced. What was immature becomes more mature. So now when I come back to this passage from Ephesians, I'm met with how I saw it as a young boy. I read it quite straightforward and literal. Paul's talking about the breastplate of righteousness, the helmet of faith, the belt of truth, and the shoes of the gospel of peace, and the sword of the Spirit. And I understood this to mean that we're preparing ourselves to live in this fallen, sinful world where bad people are on all sides of us trying to lure us into a sinful life, trying to lead us down this temptation or for that temptation. And we have to prepare ourselves as best as possible to be as good people as possible. And I think that is fine I think that was a fine interpretation for me at that time. There was probably a time in my life, one that I have since blocked from memory, where I even read this as sort of a passage about spiritual warfare, that there was this cosmic or supernatural battle between angels and demons being waged, and the forces of good and the forces of evil, and God and the devil, and I was like a foot soldier in this cosmic battle. As I grew older, I began to reject that view more and more. And because I was so convinced that that's what Paul was talking about, I began to reject Paul also. I stopped reading Paul, and I certainly wouldn't have given a sermon about Paul. But again, as I've grown older and a little bit more mature, I've begun to see Paul in a different light too. See, there's lots of reasons to dismiss Paul, not just the spiritual warfare aspect, if that's in here. But Paul has a lot of difficult stuff for us, especially in a church like this. He refers to the Old Testament as skubalon. Skubalon is a Greek word that I really shouldn't translate from the pulpit. It's the polite way of saying it would be animal feces. So this is the word that Paul uses to describe the Old Testament. He uses a lot of hateful languages. He refers to homosexual men as arsenokoines, which is a word I definitely won't translate from the pulpit. It's a very graphic, violent, nasty word that we wouldn't use in mixed company, or any company. He also says that women shouldn't speak in church. He says that women should cover their heads when they come into church. There's a lot of things in Paul that are quite troubling to us. But as I've grown older, I've come to value a person's actions more than their words and more than their beliefs. And Paul has some pretty remarkable actions. I've also come to see him not as this flat, one-dimensional or two-dimensional character, but a full flesh and blood person in the Bible with all of the complexities of a real human person. He sometimes contradicts himself. He seems unsure about a lot of things, and he seems to change over the course of time. He's a real person, and he says many times, I don't do what I want to do, and I do what I don't want to do. Meaning he's a very fallible person. He knows what he ought, but he often does what he not.